она начинает как раз дискуссии в рамках нашей конференции, и мы очень это ценим, мы очень ценим возможность услышать позицию МВФ в отношении ключевых проблем мировой экономики, которые вот накопились на протяжении прошедшего года, прошедшего с предыдущей конференции. И очень рады, что Аннет Киобе сегодня тоже с нами. Аннет, на этом я хочу передать слово вам. Пожалуйста, еще раз спасибо за то, что присоединились к нам сегодня.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you especially for the invitation from the Higher School of Economics to present to you, and thank you to everybody attending. My contribution is going to be to present how we at the International Monetary Fund view the economic conjuncture, but the economic conjuncture in Europe predominantly. And this is 2 years into the pandemic. I should warn you that the numbers that I'm going to present are as of our October forecasts, and will not, for example, reflect our thinking around the Omicron variant, but policies around support to the economy will predominantly remain the same. With this, I will share my presentation, and we can begin. Thank you. Let's start with the good news. Prospects in Europe have improved considerably in the last 6 months. Europe here is charted in the first bar in dark blue, and it's now the region with the highest share of fully vaccinated people at around 55%. However, there's still reasons to be concerned about the recovery, notwithstanding good progress on vaccination. And that's because progress with vaccination is highly uneven across the globe, with vaccination rates in emerging Europe, for example, only half of those in advanced Europe. And furthermore, the pace of vaccination in emerging Europe has slowed appreciably. Vaccinations have supported the recovery in activity, and mobility had substantially increased. Mobility is important, as it was the main factor behind the collapse in activity in 2020, as we can see from the middle chart, where we have decomposed the contributions to real GDP growth in 2020 into underlying growth, policies, initial conditions, and mobility in a group of emerging and advanced countries. Mobility here is in the light blue part of the bar. The recovery is proceeding at multiple speeds across sectors. As I show in the third chart, manufacturing in purple, this is goods, has bounced back despite significant supply side disruptions, while the traditional hard-hit services such as arts and recreation, hospitality and trade are still lagging behind. Headline inflation has surged. As shown in the first chart, the key factors behind this increase in inflation has been the rise in energy prices. This you can see towards August 2021 in light green. Reassuringly, non-energy services inflation, shown in blue, has been rather moderate, suggesting that at least for now, the inflation pickup has not translated into broader wage pressures. Supply disruptions are reflected in an increased backlog of works and delays in delivery times. This I plot in the second chart, and these have exacerbated these supply-demand mismatches. These developments have raised concerns predominantly in emerging markets that high inflation may last, thus pushing up inflation expectations, which then might result in wage price spirals and further inflation. This has already happened in some European emerging markets, and this we show in the right chart in yellow-orange. We see an increase in inflation expectations in the median and also across the higher and the lower percentiles. However, in most advanced European economies, and this we chart in blue, inflation expectations remain well below central bank targets. Turning to the outlook, with the caveat that I mentioned earlier that we will revise these figures into the new year, For 2021, this is the second set of columns. We estimate Europe to grow at 5.5%, advanced Europe to grow at 5.2%, and emerging market European economies to grow at 6%, excluding Russia and Turkey. We forecast growth of 5.3% for this year. These are significantly higher growth forecasts relative to what we expected in July. However, the recovery is expected to consolidate and slow into 2022, with the peak of the cyclical recovery behind us for the most part in 2021. Lower growth rates into 2022 reflect not only the maturing of the recovery after the initial bounce back from lockdowns, but also less fiscal policy support in many economies. As shown in the right chart, policy support, this is public consumption in teal, in the bar charts is projected to wane into next year, where we expect private consumption. This is the red portion of the bar is expected to step in. Now to the risks. In the near term, these are still tilted to the downside. Pandemic risks continue to dominate. The evidence on the transmissibility and severity of Omicron is still rapidly evolving, but at least at this stage, it seems that the variant, while much more transmissible, seems less severe. But the possibility of further virus mutations and waves of the pandemic mean that uncertainty is still high, even if conditions now are far better than they were in 2020. Beyond the pandemic risks, several new risks have become important and much more prominent. And these are risks around prolonged supply disruptions and higher energy prices, which could limit production in key sectors and trigger broader inflation pressures and faster monetary tightening than anticipated. This would slow down credit and activity significantly. Alternatively, a faster decline in household savings rates could accelerate activity, especially in advanced economies. So what are the policy priorities at this juncture? Starting with fiscal policies, fiscal policy in 2021 was broadly supportive. As shown in the first chart, countries in both the euro area and the non-euro area have implemented the gamut of policies. These range from hiring and investment subsidies to active labor market policies, to aid in training and reskilling, to help with job searches. And countries have rightly begun to shift from providing just general lifelines to the economy to measures that help facilitate this resource reallocation across sectors. Looking forward, in advanced countries where fiscal support was especially extraordinary, the thinking is that support should be scaled back. The pace of rescaling, of course, will be very country specific and reflect the strength of the recovery and the fiscal situation across different countries. Looking at the second chart, currently primary deficits are projected to decrease substantially next year by about 4 percentage points of GDP in advanced economies. This is the first set of blue bars, and 1 percentage point in emerging markets. This is in orange. The view is that credible medium-term plans should be made to rebuild fiscal space, again, in countries that don't have it. And this should be achieved by targeting modest fiscal deficits of the medium term. And this would be consistent with reducing debt ratios. On current policies, reassuringly, most countries will stabilize debt ratios by 2026. Moving on to monetary policies. In the first figure, we chart projected inflation at the end of next year against central banks' inflation targets. And what we see is that in many advanced countries, these are plotted in blue, inflation is still projected to remain below target. In these economies, monetary policy should remain accommodative, as well as in those emerging markets where expectations are well anchored and there are no signs of generalized inflation pressures. In the second chart, we plot the inflation gap against real policy rates. Countries above the zero line are above their inflation target. Below the zero line are countries below the target. And you can see that in many countries, real policy rates are still negative, except for Russia and Moldova. So in those economies where output and unemployment gaps are expected to close soon and where inflation is running appreciably above target, and these are countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and Turkey. And in these countries where risks for second round effects are building, a gradual scaling back of monetary accommodation is warranted. And indeed, many of these countries have begun to normalize interest rates. Moving on to financial sector policies and what these should do given the conjuncture. Here we plot real credit growth, and what you see is that there has been a recent contraction in credit to firms in many countries in advanced Europe and in emerging Europe, excluding Russia and Turkey. This is shown in dark blue in this chart. And this reflects, for the most part, base effects and tightening lending standards across banks in these economies. If needed, access to credit, could be protected by providing liquidity support to firms and by relaxing bank capital buffer requirements. While supporting access to credit, country authorities may need to recalibrate some macroprudential policies to rein in the buildup of systemic risks in certain segments. For example, in real estate markets, including in Russia. It would also help to mitigate solvency risks of viable firms, including by catalyzing private equity investment. Finally, on structural reforms, a key question for policymakers will be to what extent is the uneven effect of the crisis across sectors going to lead to a sizable reallocation of factors of production. The first chart presents evidence from financial markets of long-lasting damage to the earnings prospects of the sectors most affected by the pandemic. And in this chart, we plot the difference in earnings forecasts between the hard hit and less affected sectors. And even 5 years after the pandemic began, this is shown by the red line, earnings of firms in accommodation and food services are expected to grow significantly less than those in professional and science services when compared to their typical differential before the pandemic. Our analysis in the regional economic outlook, which is underpinning this particular set of charts in this presentation, suggests that this would precipitate a relative reduction in the employment share of the hardest hit sectors. And in these sectors, workers are typically low skilled. This we chart in the second chart, the first column. The needed labor reallocation could be even larger if the pandemic leads to stronger than expected changes in consumer preferences or accelerates pre-existing trends of automation and digitalization. This is shown by the blue. Such reallocations have historically come with sizable adjustment costs for labor in the short to medium term. In the form of subdued employment for years to come. This is shown in the third chart where employment growth is lower 20 quarters after the initial reallocation shock. This suggests an important role for policies to help reallocation. This takes us to the next and almost final slide. While the recovery is ensuing, policies should focus on first helping the reallocation of labor and capital, and second, addressing the pre-pandemic structural challenges that still remain with us. Here, a wide range of policies could help. First and foremost, active and passive labor market policies and education policies could improve general labor conditions, lower transition costs of reallocation, enhance workforce skills, and alleviate the pandemic's impact on inequality. In addition, improved bankruptcy and insolvency frameworks could improve business confidence and investment. Boosting potential growth remains a long-standing problem. and a challenge for many economies. And here it would be your traditional policy measures such as public investment in human capital, digital connectivity, and green infrastructure investment that would be scaled up. In addition, in many emerging economies in Europe, stronger institutional and better economic governance could go a long way in providing the needed economic conditions for growth. Let me also take a moment to reiterate the importance of global vaccination for sustainable recovery. Here, countries in Europe have a role to play in not only doubling down on their domestic vaccination campaigns, but also contributing to improving vaccination globally, both as a key producer and an exporter of vaccines. Finally, it's been a long presentation, so let me just conclude with a summary of our key messages and our assessment of the risks going forward. Despite the spread of the Delta variant, the recovery in Europe has indeed advanced with improved mobility and vaccination, but the pace has been uneven across sectors and countries. We expect the recovery to consolidate in 2022 as the pandemic continues to abate, with private consumption and household savings beginning to normalize and more investment by both the public and the private sector. But we still see risks tilted to the downside. Given already high COVID infection rates in emerging Europe, a further wave of infections could present a clear downside risk to growth as we enter 2022. That said, with every subsequent wave of COVID, the hit to economic output and activity appears to decline relative to the previous wave, partly because the social distancing measures introduced are less strict, and partly because economies are becoming more resilient to these measures. And while the Omicron variant and any future variants represent a downside risk to activity, the implications for other indicators in the economy, such as inflation, for example, are less clear. One lesson from previous waves of infection is that the resulting restrictions not only curtail demand, but also curtail economic supply to the same extent as demand. And this has pushed prices higher in the process, at least in the short run. And we've seen incoming inflation data continues to surprise on the upside. But we'll see what we say at next year's conference about this. While the recovery of private spending, has progressed, fiscal support can be refocused and pared down, but carefully, especially in those economies that are still growing slowly, so as not to compromise the recovery. Monetary policy should remain accommodative in those countries where inflation expectations are still anchored, and also as fiscal support is gradually withdrawn. And finally, structural policies should facilitate factor reallocation, support the new engines of growth, and also address pre-pandemic challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. Thanks a lot for this comprehensive outlook of the state of the European economies and the challenges that the policymakers in the European countries face now. So now, dear friends and colleagues, we have time for questions. So you may write down your questions in chat and I will read them, or you may ask the floor. So please raise your hands, Zoom hands, and I will give the floor to you for your comments or questions. So feel free to choose any option you want. So let me start with the question. My question is the following. So today, even in the introductory panel, some our colleagues said that probably the crisis will continue for a long time. At the same time, some people still believe that it will finish quite soon, and that especially in Europe, where the share of vaccination is of vaccinated people is much higher, And so there are still hopes about the finish of the pandemic and the more or less quick recovery. So my question is whether these expectations about quick recovery on the one hand or about long-lasting crisis on the other hand should affect the policies different countries choose. So do the countries really should the countries really continue their crisis policies based on the expectations that the recovery will finish soon, or should they build probably the longer and more comprehensive climate crisis policies based on the expectations that the recovery was not very quick, would not be very quick, and that the crisis will follow for the coming years? And does it matter for the choice of the policies?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I think you know you've given me the answer in your question. I think because the recovery, so we did have this bounce back, but there is definitely this realization that the COVID pandemic is here to stay for a lot longer. I think the expectation was that it would become endemic much quicker. You know, that hasn't happened, and as you rightly point out, you know, Europe has been vaccinated at a much kind of faster pace and with much more effective vaccine rollout than other economies, but they're still seeing kind of waves of the pandemic. You know, perhaps on the plus side, the increased number of cases has come with a decreased number of hospitalizations. So perhaps this is not causing such a strain on health capacity, but this is with the caveat that the pandemic has been going on for now, you know, close to 2 years. Health capacity is going to become strained as medical workers you know, leave their jobs, and as other conditions that haven't been addressed, you know, begin to be addressed, other health conditions that were put on the back burner. So, you know, we don't expect that, you know, this pandemic is going to magically resolve. So it seems that countries will need to reorient their policies from kind of providing, you know, general lifelines to everybody, to providing more targeted support, perhaps in the form of specific, you know, COVID payments to those most hard hit, for example, in the health sector, you know, and also to the elderly, for instance, that perhaps aren't able to rejoin the labor force because, you know, they're still worried about the spread of the pandemic. And I think there's also the realization that structures of economies might change because of the pandemic. In certain countries, you know, the US, for example, comes to mind, where closures, including of office spaces, were much more systemic than in a country like Russia, for instance. You know, entire swaths of office buildings are going to be retooled for, you know, different purposes, you know, perhaps providing residential housing. So there is going to be, you know, some need for a reallocation of factors of production and for government policies to support this, you know, perhaps by subsidizing you know, investments that they need. This could include things around green infrastructure type investments, and also in the form of subsidies to the labor that is going to be kind of decimated, for example, in hospitality and services. And so policies are going to need to you know, invest and spend on reskilling various parts of the population. So I think, in summary, fiscal, you know, policy support, I think, is going to need to be in the driver's seat, you know, going forward, especially as, you know, inflation seems to be increasing. So monetary policy is going to need to be much less accommodative, but this fiscal policy is going to need to be more targeted, given how long this pandemic is going to last. And I won't get into it in the interest of time, but some countries are going to have fiscal constraints in the form of high debt, so they simply will not be able to afford kind of generalized fiscal support for much longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. So now we have a question from Sergei Shatalov. Please, Sergei.
Yeah, Annette, thank you very much for extremely rich presentation. And my question is, the frequency of IFI forecast revisions had surged since the start of the pandemic. What is your reading of the level of current uncertainty going forward in 2022? Is it lower than at the start of the pandemic when everything was uncertain? And most important, how does this impact the capital flows to emerging markets and or outflows from emerging markets? This is a major risk factor for large developing economies. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think we can definitely say that the level of uncertainty has definitely decreased now relative to the start of the pandemic. And I think at the start of the pandemic, we including anybody, any economic forecasters really had no clue what the shock was going to look like, about the size of it. I mean, this is why at least the advice of the International Monetary Fund in this juncture was to provide unprecedented support. It was extraordinary stimulus, not only from fiscal policy, but also from monetary policy. I think at the beginning, there really was no appreciation of how big the shock was going to be and how long it was going to last. I think there's definitely much less uncertainty. I mean, if we now have vaccinations, now I think a lot of countries, instead of implementing blanket lockdowns, are going to do targeted type lockdowns. And this link between kind of mobility and activity has decreased somewhat, in the sense that I think even manufacturing firms have figured out how to operate in these pandemic conditions, whether it's by using more capital and less labor. There's definitely been some learning by doing, and because of that, I think uncertainty has definitely decreased. But of course, as you say, in responding to the pandemic, perhaps other risks have been built up. And this is in the form of higher debt in a lot of advanced European economies, higher debt in the US, for instance, how quickly this is going to need to be stabilized, and what this means for Fed policies and how quickly they're going to raise interest rates, and what this is going to do to capital flows in emerging markets. And I think it's definitely a risk. But one that could be well managed if the Fed is very clear about how it's going to normalize policy and at what pace. I think emerging markets also didn't spend as much as advanced economies during this pandemic, so they're not starting off with, of course, a few exceptions. They're not starting off with very high unsustainable debt levels. So I think a lot of emerging markets had gotten their fiscal houses in order and are already beginning to kind of normalize policies, and we expect debt ratios to stabilize by 2026. Of course, there are some countries, with higher debt, with higher gross financing needs, with less kind of prudent macroeconomic policies that are probably going to be much worse off in terms of capital outflow. But we don't expect this to be a generalized phenomenon across all emerging markets. Thank you.
Thank you. So, do we have any other questions? I do not see any questions in chat. Please, colleagues, feel free to ask to raise your hands, so we have an opportunity to have a couple of more questions in the coming 15 minutes. So actually, I have one more question, if I may. So you said a lot about the challenges of multi-speed recovery within the region. So we understand all that different countries will recover in different pace and with different success. And the level of debt in different countries is also very different. The same is true for the countries of the Eurozone. And so my question is about the challenges of this multi-speed recovery within the Eurozone for the Euro, because monetary policies in this region are very important, but they will be relevant to different extents to the different countries of the currency union, because the different countries will have different needs at the different stages of their recovery. So what are the implications for the Euro, which will face this challenge of multi-speed recovery, which I think is very important for the Eurozone and for the role of the Euro in the Eurozone, for the European Central Bank. Yeah, probably this is the largest, the most important multi-speed dynamics of the European countries since the beginning of the Euro itself. So what are the implications for the European Central Bank and for the opportunities to have the single monetary policy in the Eurozone given this challenge of the multi-speed recovery?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but I don't know if it's any different, if this conjuncture of a multi-speed recovery is any different than what we saw in the Euro area before the pandemic, with kind of the north-south divide, with countries like Germany, the Hanseatic League, this is countries like Austria, the Netherlands, that were calling for kind of much faster fiscal consolidation than countries like Italy, Portugal, Greece in the south. So I think this has always been a challenge for Europe, because they don't have a common fiscal policy. For instance, they have a common monetary policy, but there's no common fiscal policy with political buy-in from all of the Euro area members. I think what's correct is that perhaps the challenge of this multi-speed recovery has made these differences more stark. But I think what we can see from Europe is that they really seem to have come together in this particular crisis to kind of solve these divisions. And there's been a lot of I guess I shouldn't call it inter-country fiscal transfers, but there've been a lot of policies put in place in the form of these kind of EU generation funds, which countries have access to. So the point is that there will be a common monetary policy still run by the ECB, kind of calibrated on Euro area inflation. But for these divergent recoveries, there'll be fiscal policies that will support these recoveries. So I've seen much less of this discussion about disintegration of the Euro area now than I saw when I was working on the Euro area, for instance, 5-6 years ago, when I don't know, maybe there is something about a crisis bringing people together, and so I don't see any massive disintegration or fallout from, or I should say, a drop of the euro as a common currency following this pandemic shock. Thank you.
May I? Dear Mrs. Kiobe, it's a pleasure to see you again with us. I have a very simple question. We understand that we have already the turnaround in the United States and Federal Reserve System on inflation concerns. We have very fast commodity cycle up. We may have a commodity cycle down in a year if industrial, it's not GDP recovery more than industrial recovery. So if there is a flattening of recovery, we may have anti-inflationary measures and some commodities may be going down from the current high level. So we may be entering to the new vicious circle or swings as we saw it for the last decade. What do you think? How much of this risk, say, in a year from now?
Yeah, I don't know. when I've been looking at kind of commodity cycles, and here, by commodities, let me narrow the question down, or my response down, to kind of oil, perhaps, and gas, and metals, for instance, these type of commodities. I mean, the discussion around this seems to be that, yes, we are in the middle of a commodity cycle up, but this is a cycle that will last for a long time. I mean, first, because globally, it seems that there's some consensus on the importance of climate and this green transition. So it seems there's going to be a lot of investment demand for kind of green infrastructure, which will rest on commodities, not only, but here it's commodities that include metals, for instance, different types of metals. But because investment in kind of oil and gas did come down in anticipation of this green transition, prices on oil and gas are also expected to remain high. Gas, especially because there's still the view that this might be a bridging fuel for the green transition. So at least in all of the discussions I've seen and all of the forecasts I've seen, I haven't seen the end of this super cycle, at least not over the next 5 years. And I mean, maybe after that, if there's another sudden kind of crash in demand for some reason, whatever the next black swan is, then we might see the end of the commodity cycle. But for now, all of the kind of projections and forecasts I've seen are still for the up and up. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from Andrei Markov.
Yes, please. Thank you, and thanks for excellent, comprehensive overview and projections. But I remember a few years ago there was an excellent paper from IMF staff, maybe discussion paper, covering the economic and broad kind of longer-term implications of Brexit. I understand we are currently more on COVID and macro, but we are now, and Europeans are right now in the situation when those implications of Brexit are in effect. Do you have any views on what's happening on that front for UK economy? Primarily, but also maybe for European and trade impact. Thank you. And Annette, why don't you switch on the camera, because we hear you perfectly, but we don't see you.
Sorry, I had thought I was on. I had switched it off during my presentation so that you could focus on the slides and so that there wouldn't be problem with bandwidth. But yeah, sure. Sorry, didn't realize that.
Yes.
Can you see me now?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, so on your question about Brexit, I mean, to be honest, I really have not followed Brexit of late. We've been, at least I have been so focused on the pandemic, so I can only give you kind of a superficial answer to this question. I think, where we have seen the impact of Brexit is, I think gas prices in the UK, for instance, are probably higher than the rest of Europe, simply because they now have exited, this common union, and have had to do things like kind of secure kind of gas supplies for their own. But I don't have a good view on kind of Brexit impacts in the context of this pandemic. I mean, we did have an SDN that did talk about kind of long-term effects and quantify it across different sectors depending on how Brexit played out. But I haven't followed kind of updates and how it did effectively play out. But I will, if I have your email here, I can see it's a Markov,
yes.
1953. I'll check with colleagues that are working on Brexit. They will have a much more substantive and useful answer for you, which I will forward.
Thanks, that's very, very helpful. Thanks, I would appreciate it. My students at Moscow State University are interested in that.
Definitely get back to you on it.
Not only your students, all students are interested. But some students are more interested than others.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we have a couple of more minutes to continue and to have one more questions. Like one more question. Who wants to ask it? Yeah, if nobody, then I will ask one more. So you mentioned, Annette, the consensus of the global community and especially the European community on the necessity of green measures and of green transition. So I know also that the IMF has some proposals on the design of green transition worldwide based on the introduction of carbon price. Differentiated by countries, but still more or less universal. So from the perspective of the IMF, so do such measures as the introduction of carbon price globally, or let's focus on the European region right now, would be compatible with the objectives of green recovery given the situation with the pandemic. So whether these fiscal measures based on the introduction of carbon price be good for economic growth and economic recovery already in the near future?
And I think it's a good question. I think what the answer rests on is what you do with the carbon taxes that you generate once these are imposed. So the idea is that you would generate some minimum carbon tax, as you said, differentiated by income level for countries. And with the tax that you collect, you can then kind of redistribute it to other sectors that you want to support in the context of this green transition. You can use then the proceeds from this carbon tax to subsidize those sectors of the economy that are left behind, kind of households that are left behind from this green transition. And the idea is that if you take these carbon tax and invest in the economy, presumably you should see some positive kind of growth trade-offs. So that would be my simple answer to that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And this answer is pretty much the same as we analyzed the same issue on the recent report that we published together with the World Bank on the possibilities of introduction of carbon price in Russia. So the same idea, if these revenues that are collected by the government are redistributed then to investments, so it would be even positive for economic growth. Yeah, but may have some implications for the household incomes at the same time. Well, okay, thanks a lot. I think that's we may finish here with your part and your contribution. Thanks a lot for your presentation and for the answers to the questions that we had. We are always happy to have you at our conferences, and we are happy that we have such an opportunity to listen to the position of the IMF from your words and with your personal participation. We hope that we will have the same opportunity next year as well. Thank you, Annette, again.